The moment you truly let go, not angrily, not dramatically, but calmly, that's the moment the entire dynamic between you and her quietly changes. Most people think letting go means losing. They believe that if you stop chasing, stop arguing, or stop trying to prove your value, you're somehow giving up the connection. But in reality, letting go often does something far more powerful than chasing ever could. It removes the control she thought she had. In many relationships, especially when emotional distance begins appearing, one person starts believing they understand exactly how the other will react. If she pulls away a little, she expects you to move closer. If she becomes quiet, she expects you to fill the silence. If she creates distance, she assumes you will chase her harder. And when someone becomes confident in predicting your reactions, they start feeling emotionally in control of the situation. Not necessarily in a malicious way, but simply because the pattern becomes familiar. She knows you care. She knows you will reach out. She knows that even if she steps back, you will eventually step forward again. But the moment you truly let go, that pattern breaks. Instead of reacting emotionally, you become calm. Instead of trying to force conversations, you allow silence to exist. Instead of chasing someone who is pulling away, you simply focus on your own life. That quiet decision sends a message stronger than any argument because suddenly the reaction she expected never arrives. The text she thought you would send never appear. The emotional conversations she assumed would happen simply don't happen. The attention she believed would always be there slowly disappears. And when the expected reaction doesn't happen, something interesting begins inside the human mind confusion, not because you did something dramatic, but because the predictable script changed. Before, she felt confident about how the story would unfold. She believed she knew exactly how you would respond to distance. But when you let go calmly instead of chasing, the situation becomes harder for her to understand. Now questions start forming in her mind. Why didn't he fight harder? Why did he accept the distance so easily? Did he stop caring? Did he move on? These questions appear because the emotional control she believes she had suddenly disappears. When someone expects you to chase them, they feel safe testing the connection. But when you respond with calm detachment instead of pursuit, the balance quietly shifts. Now, she can no longer predict your next move, and when someone can no longer predict you, they start paying much closer attention to you. After the moment you truly let go and stop playing the role she expected, the next thing that begins to affect her deeply is something most people misunderstand: indifference. Indifference is not anger, it's not bitterness, it's not pretending to be cold while secretly hoping for a reaction. True indifference is simply emotional neutrality. It's the state where your life continues forward without needing validation from the person who walked away. And that kind of energy is incredibly powerful. When people expect a reaction from you, they are prepared for certain outcomes. They may expect you to argue, to try to convince them to stay, or to explain your feelings repeatedly in hopes of repairing the connection. Even negative reactions like anger or frustration still show emotional investment. They signal that the connection still has strong influence over you. But indifference removes that signal completely. When you stop reacting emotionally to someone's distance, you create a psychological shift that can be difficult for them to understand. The person who once saw clear evidence of your emotional attachment suddenly sees calmness instead. No arguments, no attempts to pull them back, no emotional pressure, just quiet acceptance. And acceptance can feel far more unsettling than conflict because when someone argues or chases, it confirms that their presence still holds strong influence. It shows that the connection still has control over your emotional state. But indifference communicates something very different. It shows that your emotional center is no longer tied to their actions. At first, she may not immediately react to this change. On the surface, she might continue acting the same way she always has. She might even believe that your silence means you've simply accepted the situation and moved on completely. But beneath the surface, the lack of emotional reaction begins creating curiosity. The person she once understood emotionally now feels different. The man who once reacted to every shift in the connection now appears calm and unaffected. And when someone who once showed strong emotion suddenly becomes emotionally neutral, it creates a powerful contrast. That contrast forces the mind to start paying closer attention. She may begin wondering what changed inside you. Did he finally stop caring? Did he grow stronger? Is he focused on something new in his life? These thoughts begin appearing because indifference removes the emotion feedback she once received from you. Without that feedback, the mind begins filling the silence with its own questions. And sometimes the absence of emotional reaction becomes far louder than any emotional response ever could be. Because indifference quietly communicates a powerful message. Your life is no longer centered around the need for her attention. Once indifference replaces emotional reactions, something else begins to take its place in the dynamic between you and her: silence. And silence has a unique psychological effect that most people underestimate. When communication stops, when the constant back and forth disappears, and when the emotional noise of arguments or explanations fades away, the mind naturally begins to fill that empty space with its own thoughts. Before the silence, the relationship had movement. There were messages, conversations, reactions, and responses. Every emotion had somewhere to go, and every moment of uncertainty could be answered with another interaction. But once silence appears, there is nothing left to interrupt the mind's natural process of reflection. And reflection can be incredibly powerful. Without your voice constantly explaining things or defending your actions, she begins replaying the past in her own head. Conversations that once seemed small may suddenly feel more significant. Moments she once brushed off might start appearing differently when viewed from a distance. This happens because silence removes the distractions that once existed in the connection. When people are constantly communicating, they rarely take the time to analyze what is actually happening between them. Emotions move quickly, reactions happen instantly, and the mind focuses on the present interaction instead of the deeper meaning behind it. But silence slows everything down. In that quiet space, memories begin surfacing. She might remember the moments when you showed genuine care, the times you were patient, supportive, or understanding. Things that once felt normal in the relationship can suddenly feel more meaningful when they are no longer part of her everyday experience. And this process doesn't happen because you tried to convince her of your value. It happens because your absence gives her mind the space to notice it. When someone is always present, their presence becomes part of the background of daily life. But when that presence disappears completely, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Silence also removes the opportunity for emotional defenses. When people are in the middle of a disagreement or distancing themselves from someone, their ego often protects them by focusing on the negative aspects of the connection. But with time and silence, that defensive mindset begins softening. The mind starts remembering not just the conflicts, but the good moments as well: the laughter, the support, the comfort that once existed in the relationship. And because those moments are no longer happening, they begin carrying more emotional weight. Silence doesn't force someone to miss you, it simply gives their mind the quiet space where realizing your absence becomes unavoidable. Sometimes the loudest realization a person can experience comes from the quietest distance you create. After silence has had time to settle in, something interesting often begins to appear on the surface. She seems happy. You might notice pictures, posts, laughter with friends, or an attitude that looks completely unaffected by the past connection. From the outside, it may look like she moved on quickly and effortlessly, but what many people don't understand is that appearances after a separation are not always a reflection of what someone truly feels inside. Human beings naturally protect their ego, especially after the end of a relationship. When a connection ends, admitting sadness, regret, or uncertainty can make someone feel vulnerable. It can feel like admitting they made a mistake or lost something valuable. And for many people, that is uncomfortable. So instead of showing that vulnerability openly, they create a different image. They present themselves as happy, confident, and completely unbothered by the situation. Not necessarily because they are pretending in a malicious way, but because the mind is trying to regain emotional control. When someone posts smiling pictures, spends more time socializing, or seems suddenly full of excitement about life, it can sometimes be part of that natural defense mechanism. It's a way of reassuring themselves and others that everything is fine. But the interesting thing about emotional defenses is that they usually focus on the outside world. They shape how someone appears to friends, family, and social media. They create the image that life is going perfectly well without the previous relationship. Yet inside the quiet moments of daily life, those defenses don't always carry the same strength. When the day slows down and distractions fade, thoughts have a way of returning. The mind begins revisiting memories, conversations, and moments that once felt ordinary but now feel distant. And this is where the contrast begins forming. On one side, she shows the world that she is perfectly happy. On the other side, Her mind quietly processes the emotional space that used to be filled by your presence. That internal process can take time. Sometimes people convince themselves for a while that they truly feel nothing about the past. They focus on moving forward quickly, filling their schedule, surrounding themselves with new experiences. But emotions that haven't been fully processed rarely disappear immediately. They simply wait for the moments when silence returns. And when those moments arrive, the difference between the image she shows the world and the feeling she is still working through becomes much clearer in her own mind. Because pretending to be happy may convince others for a while, but the mind always knows when something meaningful has been lost. As time passes and the silence continues, something else begins to happen quietly in the background. She starts reevaluating the value you once had in her life. This process doesn't usually happen immediately. In the beginning, when emotions are fresh and distractions are everywhere, the mind often focuses on the present moment and the sense of freedom that comes with change. But when the noise fades and the excitement of new distractions slows down, the mind naturally starts comparing the present with the past. This is where absence begins revealing something powerful. When someone is constantly present in our lives, their value can slowly blend into the routine of everyday interaction. Their support, their attention, their presence becomes something that feels normal, not necessarily unappreciated, but familiar enough that it doesn't stand out anymore. People get used to it, but once that presence disappears, the contrast between what used to exist and what exists now becomes much clearer. She may begin noticing that certain types of conversations no longer happen the way they used to. The kind of understanding that once felt natural might not appear in new interactions. The emotional comfort she once experienced may be harder to find elsewhere. These realizations don't come all at once, they appear slowly, often through small moments. Maybe she experiences a situation where she remembers how you used to respond differently. Maybe she notices that someone else doesn't listen with the same patience you once had. Maybe a memory appears unexpectedly. Something simple like a conversation, a shared experience, or a moment of laughter that once felt ordinary. But now that memory feels different, not because the moment itself changed, but because the person who was part of it is no longer there. And when the mind begins recognizing these differences, it starts reevaluating the value of what once existed. This is the part many people overlook when they try to force someone to see their worth during a relationship. When someone is constantly trying to prove their value through words or persuasion, it can actually reduce the impact of that value because true appreciation often appears through contrast. It becomes clearer when something meaningful is no longer available. Your absence quietly creates that contrast, not through manipulation or emotional pressure, but simply because your presence once filled a space that now feels noticeably empty. And when someone begins recognizing the emotional stability, attention, and understanding that once existed in that space, they start realizing that losing it may have meant losing something far more meaningful than they initially believed. And eventually, everything leads to the final stage, the moment when the man who truly let go becomes the one who is the hardest to forget. Most people misunderstand the real power of letting go. They think it's a strategy to make someone come back or a way to trigger regret in the other person. But real letting go isn't about controlling someone else's emotions. It's about reclaiming control over your own life. When you stop chasing someone who is uncertain about you, you create space for something much more important than their attention. You create space for your own growth. Instead of constantly thinking about what she is doing, why she pulled away, or how to win her back, your focus begins shifting toward yourself. Your energy goes into your work, your goals, your friendships, your physical and mental strength. Life starts moving forward again. And when a man truly moves forward, instead of staying emotionally stuck, something about his presence begins to change. His confidence becomes quieter but stronger. His attention becomes more intentional. He no longer feels the need to convince anyone of his value. That kind of mindset is difficult to replace because what made the connection meaningful in the first place was not just attraction or chemistry. It was the way you showed up in the relationship, your presence, your attention, your consistency, and the emotional stability you brought into the dynamic. When you remove that presence and continue growing without looking back, the contrast becomes even stronger over time. She may meet other people, she may experience new relationships, but the mind naturally compares past experiences with present ones. And when someone once experienced a connection with a person who had genuine confidence and self respect, that memory tends to remain powerful, not because you tried to compete for attention, but because you didn't. You walked away with dignity, you respected yourself enough not to beg for someone's affection, and instead of holding on to bitterness, you chose to keep moving forward. That kind of ending leaves a lasting impression because deep down, people recognize when they encountered someone who truly valued themselves. They recognized the difference between someone who needed validation and someone who simply shared their presence. And the truth is, people may forget arguments, disagreements, and emotional moments over time, but they rarely forget the person who had the strength to let go, grow stronger, and move forward without needing to prove anything to anyone. Because the man who truly moves on becomes the one who quietly stays in her memory the longest.